Greetings, you curious or Herle Burly-ites. To start the pod today, I want to give a shout out to Karen Restuel, a longtime listener to the show and friend of mine. Karen is Director of Indigenous Affairs and Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and she joined Oyster Group Public Affairs as a Senior Advisor just a couple of weeks ago. Karen suggested today's guest and then was instrumental in putting us in touch with him, and that guest is Mark Podlasly. Mark is a member of, and give me some points for this if I get it right. Mark is a member of the Nlaka'pamux Nation in British Columbia.
Oh, very good. I'll give you 9.5 for that.
Wow, excellent, thank you. And he's the CEO of First Nations Major Projects Coalition. The FNMPC is an Indigenous-led organization involved in major energy, infrastructure, and resource developments across Canada. Specifically, Mark drives engagement and advocacy for greater economic participation for member nations. And he has over 25 years' experience leading the planning and execution of complex capital projects around the world. So, major projects, national projects, nation building. We hear all these terms coming from the Carney government, but if it's truly a national project, it has to be with Indigenous support and participation. Easy enough to say, maybe a little bit more difficult to make a reality, and that's what Mark and I are going to be talking about today. How do those negotiations happen? What's the right amount of equity? What are other factors that matter besides equity? Are there past examples we can look to for guidance? And is the governance in place to get all this accomplished? And Mark, I'm really, really glad you could join us today. Thanks very much.
I'm very happy to be here.
Right. I want to get into all those issues, Mark, but I like to start this show off by just learning a little bit about my guest. So that nation that you're from, where's that from in British Columbia?
We're from southern British Columbia. If you know where Kamloops is, we're near Kamloops or Merritt, British Columbia.
Right.
Most infamously, our nation is also host to Lytton, BC, which burned down in a fire about 3 years ago. So this is South Central British Columbia.
Right. It's actually a beautiful area, right?
Oh, it's a gorgeous area. It's a gorgeous area. And of course, every guest you have will tell you that it's the best place in the country.
Well, I never say that about Regina. Bragging about the Rough Riders. In any event, what was it? What kind of did you grow up on reserve?
So I grew up a different. I grew up mostly in Vancouver, but home to reserve. Summers, holidays on reserve. So it's about a 4-hour drive from Vancouver. So it's easy enough to get back to. So I grew up between the two, and did most of my education in Vancouver, and then eventually ended up overseas and working overseas in major projects.
It's like moving between those two worlds, Mark.
Well, you know what? A lot of Canadian Indigenous people do that. Half of Canada's Indigenous population is now off reserve. So it's not an unusual thing to see this circulation between on reserve and off reserve. Economic opportunities, education opportunities generally are off reserve. That's changing depending on the reserve in the country. But there's an incredible flow of talent between the cities and the reserves in this country, which most Canadians don't recognize or do understand that's happening.
Let me ask you the most ignorant question possible, which is, once you're in Vancouver, why would you go back to the reserve other than to visit family?
Because that's my homeland. My heart is there. That's where I was raised, and that's where I learned a lot about the values that I carry through life. And it's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. And so, yeah, family's there, but there are opportunities. I'm still very involved in my home community. My home community hosts Canada's largest open pit copper mine. And out of that, we have a revenue sharing deal, and which is essentially an Indigenous sovereign wealth fund at the moment, $106 million shared among the community members, and we invest it for long-term future. So there's a lot of reasons to go home.
So yet another thing under attack by Donald Trump right now is your copper mine.
Well, everything we've got in Canada is under attack by Donald, right?
Yeah.
DEI, dairy, eggs, you name it.
Totally. So, how did you get into the major projects? You sort of like skipped. You said, well, I got most of my education in Vancouver and spent some time on the reserve, and then all of a sudden I'm overseas doing major projects. How did that come together?
I started my career in British Columbia with a company called West Coast Energy, which is now part of the Enbridge pipeline system, north-south. A lot of natural gas, shipping gas from northern BC down to the lower mainland of the province.
What's it called now, Duke?
What's that?
What's it called now, Duke?
No, it was bought by Duke and then became part of Spectra, and now it's held by Enbridge.
Oh, okay.
So it's the BC pipe in the Enbridge system. But I cut my teeth there in public affairs and finance. Eventually got into Harvard. Did my education at Harvard.
As one does.
as when you come from a small town in central British Columbia, it's the natural
Yeah,
place to go.
yeah.
So no, I was at Harvard and then finished Harvard and then stayed out in Boston for years and ended up working at Harvard, working a lot of the professors at the Harvard Business School, teaching executive education courses in globalization to newly minted executives for companies going into overseas markets. So that's how I ended up overseas. And one of those projects was a city copy of Singapore that was being built by the Koreans,
Oh,
Songdo
yeah,
City. At the time,
yeah.
the world's largest P3 project, everything from a new airport to downtown city cores, entire 20-acre downtown core business structure. So I was the vice president project management of that, ran that for years. Commuted from Boston to Seoul. You want to see airline points rack up.
I bet you're a million miler.
I'm way past that.
Yeah,
So that was before I
yeah.
got home. But but my wife is Indigenous. We had a child. We had a child, and when the child reached school age, we didn't want her raised in the United States. We wanted her to raised in Canada to understand what it meant to be Canadian and to
Nice.
understand what it means to be Indigenous Canadian. So we came home. And when I got back to British Columbia, at that time, there were 11, actually 14 different LNG projects proposed across the province. It was just chaos. All these proponents are looking at different routes across the province, and they had to engage with Indigenous people. So my elders and the senior leadership, Indigenous leadership here, called me in and said, "Look, you're one of us. You've worked in this industry, and you understand the customer, which is in Asia, because you've been over there for years. What the heck is going on?" And I sat through one of these presentations by one of these multinationals when they had a whole room of a couple hundred Indigenous people, and it was very clear that they were speaking engineering speak over the heads of all these Indigenous people who were at that time required to give at least consultation leading towards consent. And I sat there and said to the elders, I said, you know what? You're talking different languages. What you need is a 101 globalization. Where do Indigenous people fit in the supply chain? That's it. So, taking the skills I learned at Harvard, that's what I did. And we nicknamed it LNG for your granny. And it's not dumbing it down, but it was pitching it, going, this is what's being asked of you. And this is where we fit in the Canadian supply chain of this global network. And that became part of the coalition. That's what we do. We sit down and LNG for your granny, small modular reactors for your granny, transportation corridors for your granny, you name it. It's just taking the information and making it available so Indigenous people can make an informed decision whether or not to participate. And if they are going to participate, what's the best way to do it?
I got one more question for you, Mark, about yourself. And it's because this never occurred to me and nobody ever raised this with me. But
Mhm.
you're a kid in Vancouver going to
Mhm.
school. How do you get it into your head that you should go to Harvard? Like, how does that happen?
I ran into somebody at West Coast Energy, had gone to Harvard, and she was impressive. I was so impressed. And so I asked her how she got the skills she did. She said she went to Harvard. And I asked her, well, if I go out to visit, can you introduce me to some people? She said, yes. So I did. And I was blown away. I sat through classes at Harvard, at the Harvard Business School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And after that, I had to go there.
All
Took
right.
took three
Cool.
applications over 7 years to get in, but I finally got there.
Cool. Very cool. All right. So let's talk about this organization now
Yeah,
that you head up. So you just sort of described what the need was, which
yeah.
is that the Indigenous community is supposed to be giving free, prior, and informed consent. And they were having these meetings, and they really did not have a meeting of the minds about what they were talking about. Right? So that's where this organization comes from.
That was one of the pieces. The other big piece of this is access to capital. Indigenous people in Canada, we are First Nation citizens, of course, but we are wards of the state. The Indian Act has put us in a situation where all our assets are held in trust by the federal government. So these
Right.
glasses, this headphone, that picture on the wall, none of this is mine. It's held in trust for my use by the federal government. So what happens if you go to the bank when you've got an opportunity to co-invest in a project and you try and get capital when you have no assets?
Right.
Zero. This happened in British Columbia. 11 of the nations in northern British Columbia had negotiated a 30% equity option, which means they had to raise their own capital to invest in the project on a natural gas pipeline, $5 billion pipe. They went off to the financial markets and found, lo and behold, no, because they don't have any they don't have assets. They have no collateral. So the interest rates or the cost of that capital was 30, 35, 40% on a regulated return of 9 to 12%. Doesn't work. They lost the opportunity. Those chiefs were part of the communications, which I talked about earlier in the LNG 101, because it's a gas pipeline. they thought, okay, this is going to happen again. We need an organization with our own people who can help get us through this quandary. And that was the start of the coalition. It's not that the Indigenous people didn't want to be part of the projects. We did, but we just couldn't find the capital to invest like every other Canadian.
Right. So I just have to take a slight detour, Mark, and because anytime there's a chance to give Paul Martin some credit, I like to do it. And does this organization not come out of something called the Financial FAB? What was that?
Well, there's a number of organizations out there in the financial space. There's the First Nations financial. It's a financial act, but there are organizations: First Nations Financial Management Board, First
That's
Nations
the one I'm
Taxation
thinking about.
Authority,
Yeah.
and the First Nations Finance Authority. The First Nations Financial Management Board, which helps nations increase their abilities and certifies basically that they're doing accounting
Yeah.
properly on reserve funds.
Yeah.
We, as an organization, were co-hosted with them to start. So we did spin out of that organization. They were
Their
the
website
incubator.
claims credit for you. I know
Yes,
this.
yes, yes. So we're very proud of them as well because we did start there. For years we were there. And then when we grew up, we were allowed to go out on our own.
So let's call this one a culmination. The federal government has just announced their decision on the item we've been talking about for months and months and months here. The feds upheld the CRTC's framework that allows wholesale fiber access for internet services. Cue the celebratory hand clapping and confetti emojis. I added that little techno outburst because it's how our presenting sponsor TELUS must be feeling. You listeners know they supported the CRTC's decision right from the beginning. They're grateful for the government's leadership here because it reinforces Canada's commitment to real competition, consumer choice, innovation, and, so relevant in these times, nation building investment. It also sends a strong signal to Canadian businesses and investors that our regulatory system is transparent and stable, providing the certainty they need to invest and grow. Back to TELUS, to wind this up, they are passionate about building national infrastructure and technology because it benefits consumers and increases the productivity and innovation of our private and public sectors. And they'll continue to invest in helping address the challenges of our time: digital inequality, the responsible development of AI, the transformation of our healthcare system, environmental sustainability, and food safety and security for all Canadians. TELUS also just unveiled a new brand promise. 4 words you can read pretty much anywhere you see their logo. We are always building Canada. Powerful stuff, particularly now, and they mean it. So how does it work? What do you do? Walk me through a project. Walk me through,
So
for instance.
Let me explain. The coalition itself starts with those 11 First Nations in northern British Columbia. And the chiefs were right at that time, the community leaders. They thought this will happen again. It started happening again. But now other nations across Canada started calling, saying, well, we've got some things. Can you help us with that? Our task is to get the nations to the table to negotiate a possible equity investment and inclusion of their rights in the environmental procedures. That's it. We do not take a percentage. That 11 First Nations has now grown to 180, which is one third of all the nations in the country, who all have some major project in their territory in which they wish to co-invest. That should, for your listeners, that's one third of all the First Nations in this country want to be involved in major projects as investors, which is a big change from where it was 25 years ago. The challenge, of
Right.
course, is everyone's got the same problem: access to affordable capital. So, your question, how does it happen? A nation will call us and say, look, a proponent has come: critical minerals, lithium, Northern Ontario. And the nation has questions. We are a trusted source of professionals, usually Indigenous, about 70% of us are in the coalition. This is what lithium is. Here's the world market. Here's the risks. Here's the opportunity. Here's the potential. We will help them go through all those questions and get them ready to go to the table. Critical minerals, electric transmission lines, high-speed rail lines, new port facilities. The calls just keep coming. But it's always the
Okay.
First
Is
Nation
this a
that makes the
consult?
request. We will service First Nations. Companies do call us too. We will refer them back to the First Nation. We service the nations. We don't service the companies.
And is it a consulting service? Like, do they pay you for this, or
No, that we,
how are
okay,
you?
so because we are 70% funded by government, 30% on our own. It was 100 at the beginning. We are raising up our own funds as we're going
Okay.
because we have to get
Yeah.
away from, well, we want to get away from government funding. But it's mainly that. If a company wants to engage us, we will provide fee for service, but as a consulting arm. We have a consulting arm that we do that, but our primary focus is always on the nations.
Right. Um, so this kind of a potential bonanza coming up, isn't it? With all the talk of all the projects that are going to be going on.
We're busy. We're very busy. 180
Mm,
nations. There's only about 30 of us in the coalition spread out across the country in every time zone.
right.
So yeah, there's a lot going on right now. And what you've seen the change in the past decade and a half is that Indigenous people now are seen as potential partners in these projects, as opposed to just an afterthought in a checkbox that was going on in terms of a consultation regime. That would have been 20 years ago. But now you've got to have Indigenous consent in these projects to get through. And so Indigenous consent is you can obtain that in many ways. But from the coalition, our perspective is if you take an Indigenous partner on as a co-investor, the Indigenous party becomes a co-proponent, and no co-proponent is ever going to argue against their own self-interest. So
Right.
consent is achieved.
So I want to get into all that, but I want to level set first by just asking you your opinion. And I know that you can't speak for everybody, but I just want to get your sense. Most Canadians right now are feeling a sense of crisis, led, in part out of the United States, that we're both existentially challenged and that we're very economically challenged, and that we are a lot of vulnerabilities in our economic situation have been laid bare, and that we need to do a bunch of stuff, as the Prime Minister says, bigger things than we ever thought, faster than we ever thought. Right?
Yep.
Um, do Indigenous Canadians share that sense of crisis?
I would say on the most part, yes. We are Canadian as well. Sometimes that's forgotten in the media discussions. It's like, oh, those people over there are
No, but I
opposing these
wasn't trying to
projects.
be flip or
No,
like,
I'm
I
not.
know that
I'm hoping.
there's time frames, right? People think in different time frames is
Yeah,
one of the things I was
yeah,
thinking about. Like, we think in very short-term time frames, and Indigenous people tend to take a longer
a
view
longer
of
time.
things, right?
Yeah. But there is a sense of you will Indigenous Canadians are Canadians, proud as well. Yes, there are time differences, 7 generations, for example, or taking a lot longer financial quarter or one financial year to make a decision. But that said, Indigenous people and our coalition members want the projects. So I would say that the timelines are closer between Indigenous nations in the coalition and industry than most people in industry suspect,
Right,
if it's in the interests of the Indigenous party to participate.
right.
And that's it. If it's in the
Um,
interests.
because I had Cindy Woodhouse on here, and you know, we had a great conversation, but I did not detect a sense of urgency out of her that these things had to happen right away. Right? It was like, let's take our time and get it right, which is a different recipe than the one that most people are sort of following right now.
Well, first of all, I can't speak what Cindy Woodhouse would do. She is a political
Right.
leader. She has a political mandate. She has a political reality. My mandate from our members is to get these projects for the nations. And I would say that
Mm,
the timelines are different. There's still the concern that things are going too fast, but I don't think it's going to be a 7 generation decision-making process if the nation's interests are being met. Because in these
okay.
nations, the reason they wish to be part of the projects is one, yes, they have to be done right from an environmental and social perspective, but there's an economic reality here. If you're in a nation which has high unemployment, no revenue, dependent on a government stream of income that can change month to month, year to year, government by government, you want the independence of an economic engine that is separate. Those nations are part of the coalition. If a nation does not want a project, they'll never be part of the coalition. So the 1/3 of the nations that are part of us are the nations who are a coalition of the willing, if the conditions are met.
Yeah. You were critical in the Globe and Mail in an op-ed about the process that the Carney government had put in place around the legislation, um, Bill C-5, and you were worried that it had not um, sufficiently taken into account the Indigenous role in the process. Subsequently, there were these consultation meetings. Did these solve that problem
They
or
started the
reassure you?
consultation discussion. I wouldn't say they've solved it. They've gone down the right path. And just to point out, that Globe and Mail article is supportive of the concept of what Canada is trying to do to
Oh
speed
no,
up.
absolutely.
It
Sorry, I
was
don't
very
mean to miss. Yeah,
supportive there, and raising concerns about the speed, because the speed is something we hadn't seen before. From an Indigenous perspective, given the history of this country and how projects have been pushed through, there's always going to be concern that, wait a minute, are we at the back end of this?
right.
That's the concern. But the possibilities of what major projects and nations would be, no, our members are in favor of those if they're done right. That's what the Globe Mail was about.
Okay. And are you feeling more reassured today that things are on a good path than you were
I think
when you
it's a
wrote that?
start for the discussions and conversations. However, it's not just Indigenous people writ large, it's Indigenous people who are affected by the said project. So what is the project? Is it a national energy corridor, the port to port to port discussion? That's going to affect those nations in those areas. That's where the conversations have to really focus. So it's good to start the overall conversation about what we're trying to do as a country with Indigenous people writ large.
Hmm.
But in the ground, that's the people that have to be talked to. So that's where the government will have to go, one, and the proponent. Also remember that the government isn't building these projects. They're just doing the framework so private proponents can come and build those projects. So
Yeah.
there's two parties here.
Now you have some experience with Tim Hodgson because you were on the board of Hydro One with him.
Hmm.
And a lot of people suspect that one of the reasons he's in the position he's in, natural resources minister, is because he had a track record at Hydro One of getting projects built with Indigenous participation and cooperation and all that. Do you have any sense of how he's going to manage that or what he brings to that particular job?
Well, first of all, Tim Hodgson, yes, was the chair of Hydro One. I am still on the Hydro One board. Hydro One has a record of dealing with Indigenous people where they have a policy in place now that 50% equity will be made available to the impacted First Nations of all new transmission lines in the province of Ontario built by Hydro One over $100 million. What that's done is it totally revolutionized how Indigenous people see themselves participating in the greater societal infrastructure. You have projects now that are being built, like the first one that went through that project was built and was completed 1 year in advance and $15 million under budget. When does that ever happen in this country,
Right,
Indigenous or
right, right.
not?
Right.
So yeah, that's the model that Tim Hodgson was responsible for leading at one point through his role at Hydro One. So imagine that across the country if that could be replicated.
Awesome.
And I just want
But
to point
is
out, this is
that the
not an equity
yeah,
give. This is not a grant. Those nations that are impacted by those lines have to come up with the capital to co-invest. So
right?
they're still participants, but they're not being granted something.
Um, is that a benchmark for equity? Do you think 50%?
That has become the benchmark in the country, at least in the electric sector. You'll start to see now First Nations, when that was announced, it went like a lightning bolt across the country. And now you see First Nations in other provinces when they're approached by an electric utility. That's the first question going, are we going to have a deal like Hydro One? Because that's kind of where we're going. So
Right.
that is the benchmark. And it's being picked up internationally. You're starting to see Indigenous people very well aware that Ontario has set this standard. And that's sort of the base level now.
And
But in
Hydro One's
electric, it's not always the same. Mining is different. Mining is completely different. The cost structure is different. It's also the revenue model is different.
why?
Electricity
Tell
in
me.
Canada is a regulated return. Mining, we don't know what gold will be tomorrow, next day, 3 years from now. So it's a different pricing model. So the equity involvement becomes very different.
Things that aren't happening. Can you take an example and explain to me why something isn't happening? So I remember back in the early 2010s, Dalton McGuinty started talking about this tremendous reserve of minerals
Yeah.
um, in Ontario. And then when I was working with Kathleen Wynne on the 2014 Ontario election campaign, she promised $1 billion to build a road to the Ring of Fire. And it is 2025, and there is not a road to the Ring of Fire,
Yeah.
much less any development at the Ring of Fire. Um, do you know why that is? Is there a way that could be done differently, or is that problem going to get replicated all across the country?
Well, again, it's different in each part of the country. It's a different with a different sector, different regions of the country, and each First Nation. Each First Nation makes a decision whether they're going to participate in the project or not. But in terms of Ontario, a lot of the First Nations who are opposed to the development still want basic infrastructure before the rest of these address. They'll go forward. So roads, electricity. It's very hard in many of these communities to get in and out. It's hard to find electricity. Water is an issue, clean, drinkable water. So those issues those nations want addressed before they agreed to move down this economic agenda of someone else. That's it. Those nations are looking to come up to the same living standards as other Canadians. That's where that is. The secondary thing that's going on in the Ring of Fire is because of the geography, the amount of water, the impact that's going to happen between one First Nation to another, the cumulative impacts could be huge. So those are the nations that are concerned about that. Again, that's specific to Ontario and that region. But if you look at mining projects in other parts of the country, in Manitoba, in the Northwest Territories, those mines are proceeding. And what you're doing is you're seeing nations making co-investments with mining companies to help them get done. So to your question, why isn't it getting done? It's because there's other issues that those nations want to address before they will proceed with an economic agenda of the province.
So our sponsor CN has a plan for Canada's grain crop. It affects our farmers and shippers and the economies of whole communities along CN's vast network. It is, in fact, so important that the railway is obligated by law to draw up a comprehensive plan and publish it. It just did so. Moving the grain crop out of the Canadian prairies is a staggering job. Last year, CN moved a record amount, something on the order of 31 million metric tons. That included wheat and canola and was accomplished despite labor disruptions at Canadian ports and the early arrival of some ferociously cold weather. CN railroaders are nothing if not adaptive. And the railway is determined to meet demand again this season, which, by the way, just started. As I said last week, it has spent some serious money to ensure it is ready. The railway has laid down a lot of new track and expanded its fleet of specialized hopper cars and high horsepower locomotives, all to ensure our farmers' grain moves to market promptly. There's a but here, though, and it's a significant one. CN is regulated by the federal government, and new federal regulations will have an effect on grain movement this year. There's no way around that. Changes to labor laws mean the railway needs more staff to move the same amount of freight. It also makes it harder to plan rail traffic movement and reduces supply chain efficiency. CN also opposes another federal initiative I've talked about here before, extended interswitching. Basically, that involves forcing railways to move freight back and forth between each other instead of directly to markets. It's inefficient at a time when we need maximum efficiency. All that said, CN is ready. It will give Canada's farmers maximum performance, period. So I'm a proponent of a major project.
Yes.
And I want to have the most productive relationship with the Indigenous groups that are affected by the project possible. And I want to live up to the standard of free, prior, and informed consent. What do I do?
Oh, you have to start a conversation, a relationship right off.
With who?
So with the
whom?
chief and council, the elected, the leaders of that nation.
Okay, well, but sorry, that's an important distinction, right?
Yes.
Because we've seen conflicts between
Yeah.
hereditary and elected
Yeah.
chiefs in the past
Yeah.
on some
Yeah.
projects.
So
Yeah.
first of all, you got to figure out who's the leader. Second, you got to have to start a relationship with them. And you're right. In British Columbia, we have hereditary systems in the north in some parts of the province. So you have an elected and then a hereditary. And for your listeners, the reason there's a difference is pre-contact, we had our own governance systems. In many parts of the country, hereditary. In Ontario, there's hereditaries as well.
Yeah.
Ottawa comes along, they impose this system, they put the Indian Act in, they appoint a new system of government, but the people's hearts are still with the hereditaries. So you get this weird split where the hearts of the people are with the hereditaries, but everything else goes through the elected.
Right.
Some nations in this country have figured out a way to balance that. So, for example, here in British Columbia, the Nlaka'pamux First Nation, the chief, the elected chief under the Indian Act, is not called the chief, he's called the mayor, and he reports to a council of chiefs who are the hereditaries. They've worked it out. A
Okay.
lot of places have done that. Some have not. So that's where the split happens.
Okay.
But back to you and as Mr. Proponent
Yeah.
showing up to do a
I
mine.
find the
You've
leader.
got to figure that out.
Yep.
You got to know what the background is. What's the history? Who are these people? Who's in charge? And then not just who's the title on the door saying chief, where's the power base? Where are the decisions? Because in a lot of these nations, it's the elders still. They may not be hereditary. They make the decisions. And if it's a matriarchy, it's the female elders. So you have to know all that before you go in and then start the relationship and talk from the beginning, not after you've got your permit or after you've decided where the mine's going to go. You've got to start at the front.
Okay. And what are the things that you want to talk about other than money?
Who are you? What's your value system? Who are your kids? Where did you grow up? What makes you you? It's a relationship. It's the same thing if you're going to go meet your neighbor next door. You get to know your neighbor. What do you start with? Hi, my name's this. This is how much money I make. Here's my credit rating. Well, how far is that going to get you? Not very
Right?
far. No, you've got to start off. Who are you? And that's the big one. Who are you? Not what are you? Who are you? And will they be in a relationship with you? That's
Right.
it.
But these are not normal business questions.
No, but
Nobody
this is
normally
not a
gives a
normal
shit.
business situation. If you're coming in just saying, I'm here to talk about money and how much money I can make off your land, you're not
Right.
going to get very far. This is no different than somebody going into another country. If you're going to Asia or Africa and you wanted to start something, a project there, you would do that. Proponents would do that. You go to Japan, there's a protocol. You meet people, you exchange gifts, you spend time, you eat dinner, you do drinks. As someone who's worked in Asia, oh my God, the drinks. Got to
Yeah.
keep up with the whiskey drinking. And after that, then we can talk business. It's the sense
Right.
of like, who are you? Am I getting into a relationship with you? That's it. And Indigenous Canadians are no different from that, right? Who are you?
Right. I should say it to you because I keep saying it every time I do this. I read this book once by a guy named Thomas King called The Inconvenient Indian, and he talked the different relationship with land that indigenous people have than white people, and how we just see it as something to be exploited. Let's something of value in there. Let's dig it out, sell it, make some money off of it.
Yeah.
And that indigenous people have a wildly different sense of what their relationship to land is. How does
Yeah.
that come into this?
Well, it's the same. Back to the example, you're going to Asia. You're going to, for example, to do business in Asia. People will have the same connection to their ancestral home, their ancestral villages. This is where my grandparents for 6, 7, 8, 9, 12 of generations were born, raised, died. The land has a spiritual value to the people there. It's just like it is here in North America. People have a spirit, indigenous people have a spiritual values based on that land. We know our origin stories based on the geography on where the land will provide food, everything from land to fish to animals. So there's a very different sense of what it means. And that's where you get the scales that are different. You would have read that in Inconvenience Indian. The whole timeline is different. It's not on a quarterly basis. It's not on a yearly basis. And you can't just take things out of the land, sell it off somewhere else, gone. Because guess what? The people are still there. They will see that hole for the rest of their lives and the next 7 generations and beyond. So it's still in effect. But I would suggest to somebody who's non-Indigenous is to look at this like they would look at going to a part of Canada that they find very respectful. Camp, looking out at the ocean, reverence. That's important.
In terms of involvement, what type of involvement might indigenous uh, bands want in addition to equity or royalty of some kind? And I'm thinking of actually in the project because, Paul Martin's been telling me for years that there's this brand new business class emerging in the Canadian Indigenous world of people that are interested in business, are educated about business, like business, and he thinks that there should be a transition where these things are actually run um, by Indigenous communities or
Yeah.
Indigenous people.
So first of all, the deal that used to be done would have been the trinkets and beads sort of thing. Okay, so a mining company wants to come in, wants to do a mine. Okay, we'll provide some hockey equipment to the sports team, scholarship of the school, and we're done. That's not in place now. You're starting to see a new class of Indigenous people coming forward and in groups of people saying, no, no, in the communities going, we want to have not just a say in, sorry, not just trinkets, but a say in the operation of these plants. That's where equity is going. And eventually you will start to see eventually Indigenous proponents on projects,
I was going
which
to
will
ask
be
you, do you think
a
that might
new,
happen this time around?
well, it depends on the size of the project. It's going
Right?
to depend on how large the project is. If it's a mine at $5 to $8 billion, probably not. But if it's a smaller, cleaner energy project, yeah, you will start to see indigenous proponents come forward. And it's coming.
Is
It's
that
been
what
happening
10 billion
worldwide.
is that what
What's that?
Carney's $10 billion fund is for?
No, the loan guarantee programs are there to help indigenous people get lower cost of capital. That's all it's there for. So, for example, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have no assets. So, how do you actually
Right.
get capital? All it does is lower the cost of capital. The government isn't putting $10 billion out. They're putting a loan guarantee for 10 billion. And if the due diligence is done properly, that will all be repaid from the revenue that
I see.
results from the loan guarantee. It will not even show up on Canadians' debt.
Right. Okay. But in terms of the actual operations and running, you think that this could be, I mean, like Clearwater, that's the case. Is that not the case out in Clearwater in
The
Nova Scotia?
Clearwater, for those who don't know, is a seafood processing company in the East Coast. 50% purchased by the not the Mi'kmaq, uh, Chief Terry Paul is the chief. It'll come to me as we're
Yeah,
going.
that's all right.
But they
Yeah.
did, they purchased 50% and they used different loan guarantees to make that happen. You now have an Indigenous 50% ownership, but it's only a matter of time till you start to see that replicated in other places. Indigenous people in this country, when we were doing work on this at the beginning, we figured out there's about $115 billion under control by Indigenous people in different pockets across the country. It's only a matter of time until those investments in projects in different areas will start to turn into majority investments. When
Right.
it'll happen, we don't know, but we've already seen minority investments happening by Indigenous people in these Canadian projects. So in time, it will happen.
Hmm. Is there a different risk sensitivity of things like environmental questions?
Yes, 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 because there's an indigenous sensibility about what it means to disturb the land. So nations are very concerned that the decisions they make will have 7 generation impact. So they're very concerned. That said, nations will make the trade-off if they feel it's in their interest to become co-proponents in projects on their territories.
Right. Right. And why wouldn't are there going to be controversies between different interests along a same project? For instance, I can imagine a pipeline where some
Yes,
indigenous groups would really want it
yes,
to go through
yes.
and some would really not
Yeah.
want it to go through.
Well, that's the Ring of
How do
Fire.
those kinds of things get resolved?
That's the Ring of Fire.
Right.
However,
Okay.
these things will get resolved. But often we get asked as a coalition, as an Indigenous person, going, why can't all you Indians just get along and have like one opinion
No,
on this?
it's exactly like it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and my response to that
Yeah.
is going, oh, just like all the provinces get along, right? Is that what we're saying? Oh,
Yeah.
Parliament.
Yeah.
It's like, no, it's Canadian. It's just sit around your family table, look around at the aunts and uncles and your parents. Do you all get along? No, you work it out. You work it out. What we do find, though, is that these projects, if there is a vested interest by the First Nations in the projects, either environmental or economic, the discussion is much easier for the First Nations to do it internally than it is to have it imposed from outside. So that is something to be worked out. It's being worked on, and you're starting to see some resolution.
Right. But um, if you are a proponent,
Hmm.
again, what can you do in your relations and how you approach the indigenous component to reduce the time frame that could be involved in doing this, right? Because um, that Ring of Fire example, like if that was an oil pipeline, it'd be pointless to build it. Like we're only going to be selling oil for another 40, 50 years. We can't take 10 years to build a pipeline, right?
Yeah. So your question is, how do you speed it up?
How do you speed it up?
Well, that's also what the Carney government's trying to figure out right now too.
I
And
know.
and the
Looking
big
for your
part,
advice on that.
well,
Yeah,
the advice is make it worthwhile for the Indigenous party to speed it up. If in the past, for example, it's an oil pipeline as you raised, and some nations are involved and some don't want to be involved, and it's not clear on what their involvement is, and is there any reason to do it? Is there a business reason for the nation to do it and host it? If there isn't, they're going to oppose it.
correct.
But Indigenous people are economic actors, yes, with an Indigenous environmental sensitivity. But if the conditions can be met, the chances of success are much greater if the Indigenous party has skin in the game. Does this make sense for them? Does this give a benefit environmentally or economically or socially that the nation will then come on board? And I think what you're seeing in this country now, especially with this 2 year push by the current government, is Indigenous nations will come on board if there's in their interest.
Okay. I think you used a line at the end of your Globe article, something about working at the speed of trust.
Yeah,
Is there trust in this government?
I'm going to qualify the answer to that. Indigenous people have not had a good history with governments in this country. Just look at the past 200 years. So is there trust in the government? There is optimism that things could be different. Trust is to be earned yet. So that's as far as I would say Indigenous people are at this point. Optimism, at least the members of the coalition who want to see something happen. There's optimism. We'll see if it delivers.
Different from the last 200 years or different from the last 10 years? Because the last 10 years has had, I think, the government that's been the most committed to improving things for Indigenous people I've ever seen in my lifetime.
Your question, though, was based on projects originally.
Yep. No,
And in the
I know.
past,
Yep.
let's say the
Yeah.
past Liberal government,
Yeah.
not all, well, some projects were approved, but there's still the issue about a mine. It takes 10 to 12 years to approve a mine in this country. How long does it take to approve a pipeline? That is the shift that the optimism is going to change. In
I see. Okay.
That's what I mean about the trust in
Interesting.
government, trust is speed of trust.
If the Indigenous community population of Canada gets more business focused,
Yeah.
gets involved in a lot of these things, becomes more prosperous,
Yeah.
what impact is this going to have on the way they operate? Is it going to bring different kinds of people to positions of leadership? Is it going to change some of the uh, customs and habits about, like, I mean, how do you feel about that kind of change? I mean, there must be, obviously you'd feel positive about it, but you must think about what else it will bring.
So at the coalition, we do an annual conference every year where we bring the best examples in Indigenous engagement, Indigenous corporate and government engagement from around the world to Toronto or
Yeah.
Vancouver, depending where we are, on exactly that question. What could be, what would the future look like? And the future exists. Right now, it's in Alaska. The
Oh,
Alaska
yeah.
Native corporations, there's 12 of them, and collectively, they have annual revenues of $15 billion a year. They've diversified out of Alaska into the lower 48 and worldwide. They are one of the largest tax bases that contributes to the state revenues of Alaska. They're one of the largest employers of non-Indigenous people in the state of Alaska. They're a huge going concern. And those corporations have at their core Indigenous values driving how they hire people, how they train people, and how they operate. We brought them to our conference this year in Toronto in April, and you could have heard a pin drop up front explaining this is what's happened to them, and this is how they're changing the entire economy of the state of Alaska for the better for not only Indigenous people, but
Mhm.
non-Indigenous people as well. That's the future. And that
Right.
answers your question. What does it look like, Alaska?
Right. But that sounds to me like those communities are probably run by business people.
They are increasingly investing. What they do with their $15 billion in revenue is they invest in their own people to train them to go to schools in the United States across Harvard and Princeton, get the skill sets, come home. They are highly focused on nation building with a commercial focus to drive that engine. And that's what Indigenous people here will end up doing if we were in the same situation,
Right.
focused on the values of the community in a commercial sense, of course, but still environmental, economic, social.
So are you going to have to scale up to meet this challenge as an
Yeah, we
organization?
will. We will. We will. We are in a situation now where we have 5 time zones. This is a massive country, and it's incredibly difficult to get to some of these places. And at the same time, huge optimism because if we can do this properly, it benefits not just the Indigenous communities. Canada, as you started this entire conversation, we are in an existential crisis with the United States. We are in a situation where 75% of our exports go to one country. We have got
Right.
to diversify our economy and means we have to get up to speed quickly. And the only way we're going to do that quickly is to de-risk what we're doing. And Indigenous people, elders hate hearing this, we are a risk to the Canadian economy unless we're involved, at which point we become an asset if it's done right. Getting to market faster, getting approvals in place, getting things shipped. We can do that if there's a reason for us to do it.
Right. Can you see a way in which this goes badly?
I could see a couple things. I could see the next free trade negotiations going badly with the United States, where then all of a sudden we have a hit on our dollar. The dollar starts dropping. We are in a situation then where we are a bargain for buyouts by other parts of the country, a bunch of parts of the world. We have
Right.
got to be aware of that as Indigenous people. As Canadians, we have to be aware of it. So the danger I see here is we don't move fast enough. So that puts us in a bit of a quandary as Indigenous people going, okay, do we go too fast? Do we not go fast enough? We can't go 7 generations. We can't go 15 years, but where do we land? That's going to be the challenge.
Okay. And are you working closely with the government yourself?
Not really. The government, there was some obviously we put out the the release on the Globe and Mail at the article, but no, at
Yeah.
this point, been some discussions. There's been early days. I just would like to point out, though, that the federal government is a large financial supporter of the coalition and has been very instrumental in getting us up and running and launched. So that's where we're at. But we're not
Okay.
advising on the legislation, if that's the question you're asking.
Okay. And if I'm a potential proponent,
Yes.
you laid out sort of an ambitious list of things that I should know about the people I want to work with.
Yes.
How do I learn that?
How do you learn? Like, is a opponent coming in
Yeah,
cold, saying,
how
I
do
want
I
to go
learn
build
that? Do I
something?
hire consultants? Do
Oh,
I like how do I like how do I figure out what I'm supposed to be doing?
well, first of all, you've got to start the relationship. You've got to contact the people. Don't, this is the strange thing from an Indigenous perspective. You'll see companies come in, hire an Indigenous consultation specialist who is generally not Indigenous to tell you what the Indigenous people are like. Just go to the Indigenous people, right? Just start that conversation. So you are a proponent coming in. You want to do a mine sort of northern Manitoba. You can look at a map and figure out who the nations are. Go up, start meeting people. It'll take you some time, but it's way more effective than hiring a specialist consultant out of Toronto to tell you what's going on in northern Manitoba on the ground, or telling you who are the matriarchs or who the influencers are in the community, which I mentioned usually
So did you just
female
stumble in there and start
matriarchs,
asking dumb
older.
questions, Mark?
You can, yeah.
Yeah.
Be respectful. If you're going to go to your neighbor, what do? Do you hire a consultant? I'm going to get a neighbor consultant to tell me what my neighbor next door likes about what he cooks on his barbecue. Well, no, you wouldn't do that. I think Canadians sometimes are so overly polite that we're afraid to go in and ask dumb questions. If it's done in the right manner, go. Just go. You can
I
call
don't know.
us as a coalition. We'll tell you who the nations are, like we'll do an introduction, right? But then just go directly.
I'm just
That
so
will
afraid of
serve you
what I don't
better.
know.
Well, you don't know a lot. You know what? If you don't know a lot, it's obvious to the person you're trying to meet that you don't know anything. So just get it over with, right? Just go in.
uh, oh, all right. This has been amazing. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to say since you're on here?
I did mention it briefly, is that these are not Canadian Indigenous only issues anymore. And you put it at the beginning. Canada is an existential crisis. We've got to get to market. We've got to get to attract investment to projects that are going to be built and on time. One of the things that comes up at times over in the media, especially overseas, is you hear this rumor going around that, oh, don't invest in Canada because it takes forever to get anything built. No, we've got to stop that. And a
Really?
declining economy, a dropping dollar, lower tax base, lower revenues for schools and hospitals affects all of us, not just Indigenous. And so this Canadian perception of like, oh, this is only Indigenous question is wrong. This is a global Canadian society issue. And if we can get it right, it will become a competitive advantage. And that means we would get to market faster. We should be able to attract capital easier because guess what? The risk of Indigenous blockades is gone. Oh my gosh, we should buy from Canada. We can get things done faster there. So there's a lot here if we change the vision internally of what this issue is about.
Thanks. Really, really appreciate that. And I really, really appreciate your time. Look forward to our paths coming in.
Thank you very much. It's great talking to you.
But thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. All of you Herle Burly-ites who watched or listened to this show and got Mark's wisdom. And we'll be back next week with more of the Herle Burly. And we'll see you then. Take care.
Herle Burly, Herle Burly.